And welcome everybody to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, July 2nd, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. This was at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th, 2001. But before I go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Happy Independence Day. We're almost there. It's coming Saturday. So thank you for tuning in today. Just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be taking your questions at the end of the course. Easiest way and best way to get them to us is go to ae911truth.org, and you'll go into the live webinars tab and find the, actually it's continuing education and then live webinars, and you'll see a question and answer box. Just submit it there. I'll also be going on our Facebook page and our YouTube broadcast of this webinar to find any interesting comments or questions that may appear related to this material, so you can try it that way as well. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks, Andy. Just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project in Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get into it. Maybe some of you didn't even know that there was a third tower that collapsed on 9/11. When we travel all around the country, talking to architects and engineers at conferences, we find that more than half of them are completely unfamiliar with the third worst structural failure in modern history, Building 7. Yep. After the Twin Towers, the worst failure here is this 47-story skyscraper that's the tallest building in most of our states, actually, but it looks dwarfed here next to the tallest buildings in the world at the time they were finished anyway. It's part of the World Trade Center complex, actually, Building 7, built in the 80s by Larry Silverstein, whom we'll talk about a little more later. The architect was Emery Roth and Sons, a structural engineer, Irwin Cantor. Now, this building was not hit by a plane, and yet it came down in a manner in which we'll see. You know, here's about 100 yards away from the North Tower, and so here it is, having survived just fine the collapse of the Twin Towers that morning, and it had a little bit of damage, but even NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, they acknowledged that the damage that a few beams that hit it when the North Tower came down didn't really wasn't a significant factor in the cause of this building's collapse. So it stayed there, and with a few fires burning, though, all afternoon. And you don't see those fires in most of the photos or videos, but this is what happens at 5:20 in the afternoon. The East Penthouse collapses first, as you see here. 6 seconds later, the entire building comes straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint. We're going to dissect this, but first, let's go to the official story. Shyam Sunder, the project leader of the NIST report in this case.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
So, primarily due to fires. Well, what fires? These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. And as you can see, they're relatively small. They're few, they're scattered, and they turn out to be not that hot at all. And yet, that's the cause of the collapse. These fires are burning at about 2:30 in the area of interest, and they move beyond. They then move beyond, as you can see. Let's see here. They're moving toward the east, away from the area of concern in the. Excuse me. They're moving toward the west. And I just realized I got confused by that language there. The east side on this north-facing facade is over to the left. So they're moving from east to west, from left to right. So NIST says, gosh, those fires were concentrated actually at the time of the collapse around column 79 under the east penthouse, because it did collapse first, right? So they focused their initiation of collapse theory on this column and the fires around it, with a set of arguments that say that the fire started on the south side, which is where the North Tower was. Some of the beams hit it. And those fires are hovering around column 79 for more than an hour until the time of the collapse. That's what they're claiming. And yet they contradict themselves, actually, because earlier, in their actual report, they say that the such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. And indeed, that's what fire protection engineers tell us. That's all the fuel there is to burn in a modern skyscraper. So more consistent with the actual photographs, such as you see here, the fire has moved from the east side on the left over to the west side on the right, on the 12th and 13th floor, the floors of particular interest for the initiation of collapse by NIST. So we've done our own fire progression, which does start out on the south side, and it moves through the area, according to the photographs. That's consistent. But then it moves on at by about 4 o'clock. Those fires are well past column 79, so more than an hour and a half before the collapse. Those fires are not around column 79 as NIST claims. So you begin to see the problem here. NIST is exaggerating the fires for a specific intent. Let's go further into Shyam Sunder here.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So let's move on.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
So there's a very specific set of features associated with the initiation of collapse theory that NIST is putting forth. And we're going to look at those very carefully right now. We have, first of all, long span beams over this area that they say the fire was heating up during the hour and a half prior to its collapse. So we saw that was not true also. But also we can see halfway during construction that these beams are fireproofed. And that's what's going on in this area right now during construction. That provides 2 hours of fire protection on those beams. So any fire that lasted 20 or 30 minutes could not have expanded those beams through thermal expansion, the main theory that NIST put forth. So they claim it anyway, and they suggest that the shear studs were broken. Those shear studs tie the beam to the slab up above. And they say those were broken as the beams expanded. Well, they didn't put any of the heat into the concrete slab. They put it all into the beams in a second and a half, forcing them to expand in their computer model, forcing them in their computer model to then break the shear studs. And so, but that couldn't have happened because, as we'll see, other studies show that that couldn't happen at all. I mean, if you have a fire, it's not going to put all the heat into the beam in a second and a half, right? It's going to take time, at least 20 minutes. So if the beam is not fireproofed, which it was. So we go on and find that this girder, which is supporting these beams, was said by NIST to have been pushed off of its seat on this column. And that's what caused floor 13 to fall on 12. Now, this girder also has shear studs. NIST says, oh no, that girder didn't have shear studs, but the shop drawings show that there's 30 shear studs on that girder. So this is extremely important. It's yet another serious omission of NIST. They're saying, and you always put shear studs on girders if you're going to put them on beams anyway. That's what structural engineers do. But they say, oh, they weren't there. Well, okay, let's say all this could have happened and this girder got pushed off to the right, off of this seat on this column 79. Well, that girder would have had to have been pushed 12 inches off of its seat because that's how long the seat is. But NIST says, oh, no, it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat. And then the flange, this bottom part of the I-beam, if you will, simply folded. Well, okay. But that couldn't have happened because there's a stiffener, which you can see in the photograph here. And you can see on the shop drawings, highlighted in red, that would have kept that flange from folding. So they conveniently omit the stiffener too, to allow their hypotheses to spawn freely and suggest that the girder only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat. Well, there's another problem here. Let's say that girder could have been pushed all the way off of its seat, as NIST claims. Then they say the 13th floor would have fallen on the 12th, and the 12th on the 11th, and the 11th on the 10th, and so on for 9 floors, until this column 79 is completely unbraced for 9 floors, at which time it then buckles because it's not braced laterally. And so that's NIST's theory, but that couldn't have happened either. Why? Well, it's been shown that it would have, let's go back. And it's been shown by Tony Zambodi and others that it would have required 632,000 pounds of force, dynamic force, from this floor at the point of connection at the girder to break the connections from the girders to the columns on the floor below, floor 12. But we only have 60,000 pounds, 10 times less than required to break that connection. But these values are manipulated also by NIST. So that's the theory. And then what happens? This floor, there's a complete cascading effect, an implosion, if you will, inside the building without any telegraphing. By deformation of the exterior structural steel perimeter of this form. So you would have seen massive buckling of that steel, which would have caused incredible breakage of hundreds and hundreds of stone panels on the outside, the cladding, and the windows. It would have been an incredible breaking up of the exterior because the beams on the inside of the building are very carefully welded to the beams and columns on the outside of the building. Just the columns, not the beams. So none of that could have happened. So what they're going to show you here in their computer model is that the interior gave up first and then the exterior gave up, and they only have the east side of this building to show here. Let's take a look.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
So 400 structural steel connections are failing every second. They just let them go in their computer model without any buckling or much on the outside. Let's compare it to the actual event and see if it compares fairly well, which is what they're claiming here. The video on the left, this computer model on the right, the east penthouse goes down, but we don't see any evidence of an interior failure at all on the left or on the right. What we see is something else, which we'll get to. We have the complete buckling now in their computer model afterward, but none of that is shown on the video. And it begins to tip over. So they stop it after just 2 seconds. Because I guess they don't want us to see how it's tipping over. I mean, they had 7 years to come up with this theory and produce their final report. They took 7 years. So let's this is why we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to NIST. They write back saying, well, we deny, we're not going to release that computer data to you. It might jeopardize public safety. Wait a minute. Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? After all, isn't there hundreds of similarly designed buildings out there with long span beams that might expand due to normal office fires? So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. What is it? We've had it in the West 100 years or so. We use it to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction, fantasy from reality. We have a question. How did this tower come down? Okay, we do some background research, make some observations. How have other towers come down? So we construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess in this process. Maybe fire brought it down. Okay, reasonable hypothesis. Maybe controlled demolition. There were evidence of explosions and controlled demolitions, as you'll see. So we test with experiments those hypotheses. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data and refuse to give it to the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety, right? We want all to build on the body of the work that we do. That's the core or the effect of the scientific method. We rely, we have faith in the work done by others because it was done openly, transparently. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back, try again. We construct a new hypothesis, which is what we're doing today. And until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the research. So let's do some background research. How are buildings destroyed? Fire is certainly a destructive force, but never have we lost a skyscraper. But say in a wood frame building, there would be, it's a chaotic event. It's natural, it's organic. The building wouldn't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the tons of structure that's unburnt below. It might fall over if it collapses at all. And NIST acknowledges that we only have fires burning in 20 or 30 minutes or so. That's all the fuel there is to burn in modern skyscrapers, desks and chairs and so forth. And that's why we build our buildings out of our high rises out of non-combustible materials and fireproof them with 2 to 3 hour fire protection. There we go. So Let's look and see, though, how we might expect a high-rise to behave in a fire. Like this example in a key, critical example, the largest test of its kind, 8 stories they built out of steel. Some of it is fireproofed, and as you see, some of it is not fireproof. They wanted to know what happens if they can reach a 2,000-degree fire with an incredible amount of fuel and then set it on fire and see what happens. Let's take a look.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer of the FEMA team, is referring here to 9/11 when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse primarily due to fire. And we'll get to the Twin Towers in part 2 of this 3-part series next week. But look, we don't have failure of the connections in these incredibly hot fires. And yet NIST caused, in their computer model, 400 steel connections to fail every second in order to get their computer model to fail. It's nothing like the precedent set by experiment. Experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. It's inherently stable behavior, the executive summary cites, due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Well, let's look at some high-rises that have had incredible fires on them. Let's see what happens.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
And neither did these high-rises post 9/11. Steel frame, fireproofed skyscrapers don't collapse as a result of fire. Earthquakes and other natural causes like wind can bring buildings down. Earthquakes in these cases, the buildings fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the columns supporting these buildings. The columns and beams are not severed one from another, like we find in all 3 skyscrapers at the World Trade Center. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, like we find in the World Trade Center. How about buildings that have exploded? Well, these buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms. with a solid edge leading that expansion. And that's because of the extremely hot gases from the ignition of chemicals from the explosives. We have witnesses then that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. And we'll be looking for explosions evidence today in Building 7. But here's how explosives can be very finely tuned to bring down high rises. It's called controlled demolition. There's a handful of companies in the US that are capable of doing this. That's all. It's a very scientific process. You have to have intimate knowledge of the structure. They place thousands of shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the buildings, specifically designed to sever those columns from those beams, so that the building comes down like you see, with a set of very characteristic features that can be defined. Let's take a look at those. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, if that's where they want to start. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse, usually, if that's what they want to accomplish, into the building's footprint, because there's a patterned removal of column supports that instantly removes that structure, resulting in a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, and the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. So it's broken up, ready for loading and shipment, with limited damage to adjacent structures. Feature number 6, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And 7, there's patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. We have broken up concrete floors. You don't want to have to go back in there and jackhammer those floors. Let the explosives do all that work. And 9, explosive charges visible at many floors, isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. This is all chemical evidence of explosive devices. Of course, we'd be looking also for chemical evidence left behind in the aftermath, right? So what this all is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. It's not evidence of fire. Fire can't create any one of these features, let alone all 10 of them. So if we have all 10 of them, we're gosh darn sure that we have a controlled demolition, right? There is no doubt. That's what we're looking at today. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance, with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence such as government documentation, right? You have to get approvals. You don't just bring down a high-rise building by controlled demolition in an afternoon, for instance. It takes months of approvals and setting up loading and so forth. So there's foreknowledge by people. They know in advance that the building is going to come down. It's not a surprise, as Building 7 was to most people who were not aware of the story set forth about its impending collapse. We'll get into that. Experts agree, at least though, that this is a controlled demolition, or that a building was brought down by controlled demolition. At least those experts who don't have financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. And video documentation, of course, can all be proof of controlled demolition. So with that model of proof in mind, let's apply it to Building 7 and see, first, do we have a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Here's Dan Rather observing his view of Building 7 collapse.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, that's very helpful, Dan. He's never said that after 9/11. And we've never seen, with two exceptions, the mainstream media show this, the third worst structural failure in modern history. It's just been wiped under the rug, such that not even architects and engineers know about it, most of them, because in the case of the American Institute of Architects, which has 90,000 members, of which I'm one, we did not receive one bulletin on the collapse of this building. And it should have been the most studied structural failure, perhaps outside the Twin Towers. But they had planes that hit them. There's no plane here, just normal office fires. So yes, it needs to be studied in every university, study structural engineering and architecture. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's take a look from West Street. Here's a pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Yeah. And take a look at the penthouse. The west penthouse, the east penthouse has already come down on the left side over here. In this case, now the west penthouse and screen wall drop virtually all at once. And then the building comes down. What does that mean? That means the structure underneath them dropped all at once, a half a second prior to the building's failure, overall failure. That means that it's not this collapse starting from the east side over to the west side in about 10 seconds, as NIST's theory requires. No, all the core structures around the core, which is the elevator hoistways, must have given way virtually all at once, and then a half a second later or so, the exterior gives way. This completely pulls the rug out from NIST theory again, because their theory is a left to right theory here of failure sweeping across the building in about 10 seconds. So, does it fall into its own footprint? Pretty much. The center of the pile is in the center of the property. Very symmetrical. Maybe we're not quite convinced yet. Let's put Building 7 on the left, a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11. Should it not have been the first hypothesis that NIST considered? But no, it was relegated to a set of very frequently asked questions. Years later, 10 years later, did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse? NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. Did they look for such evidence? We'll see that they admit that they didn't. And they also say the small blast capable of falling the building's critical column, failing, the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels, which is a huge blast, right? Well, we're going to discover today that you don't need high energy explosives with extremely loud bangs to bring down a building. But these relatively small fires brought this skyscraper down in the manner in which we saw. Who's not buying this? Feature number 3, is there a patterned removal of column supports? Well, how do you bring down a building symmetrically? You have to take out all the columns virtually at once. Any major deviation in that and the building will obviously begin to tip over instead of proceed straight down. Does fire have that precision? These fires. It's a question for you. Feature number 4. Is there a free fall acceleration? What does that mean anyway? Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler, who explains this for us.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Zero resistance? Let's go to a structural engineer and have him explain that to us.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
This is a column. When a column breaks or buckles, it continues to have resistance. There's resistance up to 25% of typical columns. It never goes to zero. It continues to resist. So we would never have had the 2.25 seconds of free fall that David Chandler forced NIST to acknowledge if any of those columns weren't completely removed. We would not have had free fall. Free fall is a bowling ball falling out of the sky. So here we have free fall. Where did all those columns go? NIST acknowledges the free fall in their final report, but they don't acknowledge the implications of that free fall, which is that those columns just all of a sudden disappeared. Well, how did that happen? Well, let's look at them. Feature number 5. Are they totally dismembered? Yeah. A 47-story skyscraper with moment-resisting columns and beams. They're welded to each other very rigidly for a substantial portion of this moment-resisting steel frame structure. We should have seen, 20-story tall pile composed of mostly air. But here we have, it fails like a house of cards. All the columns and beams have been severed one from another. Remember, buildings that fall naturally, you don't have it falling like a house of cards. The building is recognizable as a building at the base. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Yeah, there's a little bit of damage to the Verizon office building and the post office, but the center of the building is in the center of the property, the remaining building. Is there sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Well, let's first go to NIST's Shyam Sunder.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
We will show you why that incredibly loud sound might have been a whole lot less, and we will show you, nevertheless, witnesses of explosions like this one.
We were collapse in the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor.
A shock wave ripping through the building, the windows busting out, the building crashing down. How about this witness, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, who was on site at Building 7.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Okay, and this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
A big flash. Okay, this is very important testimony. And from this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who was with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, and they didn't realize that this building had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. They got into the building and made it up to the 23rd floor by foot because the elevators weren't working. But as they were coming down, they experienced this.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs, like this one heard in the late morning of 9/11?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
How many of these witnesses of bombs were included, do you imagine, in the final report or draft report by NIST? Not one. They claim to have interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Well, they must have missed these because there's not any reports of explosions at all, even though Barry Jennings was very detailed about the explosions he was hearing inside Building 7 before the towers ever came down. Those explosions are picked up by another witness, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which had seismographic equipment in Palisades, New York, 20 miles north of the World Trade Center towers. They picked up seismic waves of 0.6 magnitude occurring around the time of the collapse of Building 7. So they claim that they were produced by that collapse. But let's look at it. The peak seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds. But the building doesn't collapse for 10 seconds later. So how can the building collapse cause those seismic signals? Well, NIST has an answer for this. A seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of the collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from the interior of the collapse. Well, wait a minute. Let's go back and look at the collapse. The east penthouse collapses, but there's no evidence of any interior collapsing happening during that 6 seconds. And then 6 seconds later, the entire thing comes down. So how can the seismic signal be picking up an interior collapse? It makes no sense whatsoever. It's picking up the actual collapse of the building. 10 seconds, it's picking up a signal that's occurring 10 seconds prior to the actual collapse of the building. Well, what could be causing that force? Well, we go to Andre Rousseau, 2012. He's an applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. He says the bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Like the witnesses heard an explosion prior to the collapse of that building. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. So we go to another expert. Actually, in this case, NIST helps us quite a bit because we're looking for evidence of pyroclastic-like clouds, heat. And the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 was assisted by NIST in producing the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations. So NIST should have been all over the evidence of heat here, because they themselves tell us, look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions caused by causing rapidly expanding plumes of very hot gases, like we see racing away from every direction, in every direction away from Building 7. 35 miles an hour, expansive pyroclastic-like clouds of expanding, extremely hot gases in cauliflower-shaped forms with a solid edge, produced by an incredible amount of heat. Not that heat, but something more on the order of that. So let's look for it. Well, we find it in the infrared sensitive cameras aboard the NASA air flights, who is thermal mapping the surface temperatures at which in World Trade Center 7, after the collapse, we have 1,340 degree temperatures, hotter than most all office fires. 1,340 Fahrenheit on the surface. Well, wait a minute. Here's the surface. There's no fire on the surface. So how do we have temperatures mapped on the surface that are hotter than most office fires ever get to? Because something deep down in the pile is a lot hotter than that, that's radiating up to the pile and is cooling down to 1,340 degree Fahrenheit by the time it gets there. Let's look for additional evidence. Abulhassan Asani Azam.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center. Wait a minute. Girders don't melt in office fires. And yet here's the girder from the WTC 7 piece of steel that he's documenting being melted. So how did it happen? What source of heat is even possible to do that? How about FEMA author Jonathan Barnett? Fire protection engineer. Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, wait, we're talking 4,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures to melt, evaporate steel. So how did that happen? Well, it's documented also in FEMA, the FEMA report in Appendix C. It's the Building Performance Assessment Report that came out in May of 2002. It's a metallurgical examination of the steel, Building 7 steel in which they document never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. Like you see here, this doesn't happen in normal office fires. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Wait a minute. How does this even happen? This is so pertinent that the New York Times calls it the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. And yet it was completely eliminated from NIST's draft and final reports after they took over the investigation from FEMA in 2002. Just swept under the rug. And further, they claim, gosh, we couldn't test. There's no steel from Building 7. No steel recovered. Again and again and again, they claim no tests could be done. And yet, that piece of steel was provided by who? John Gross, the co-project leader of the NIST report, who's found here discovering the very piece of the ends of this evaporated beam from World Trade Center 7 provided to FEMA for their metallurgical testing. And yet his shadow is all over the evidence. And yet he's denying it even exists. So maybe the fires are 1,200 degrees at the hottest, probably. Now, hydrocarbons, buildings, and jet fuel for that matter, even though there's no jet fuel in Building 7, only produce 600 to 1,400 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. That's like the hottest office fires typically. Yet steel had definitely melted. We can see it here, pouring out of the material held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees. You can tell the temperature of molten metals by their color. We even have white hot here. So how do we get temperatures over 2,500 degrees capable of melting steel, which occurs at 2,800 degrees actually, from normal office fires? The official narrative. What caused the steel and iron to melt? Let's see if there's any evidence. Maybe thermite could have done that. Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Sorry about the flickering on that video. I'll fix that, but maybe we're getting somewhere here now, because if thermite were used, it would explain the presence of extreme heat, 2,800 degree heat to 4,000, because it releases 4,000 degree heat. That's how incendiaries work, by destruction by means of extreme heat. It would also explain the presence of elemental iron, which we're going to be showing you presently. And it would also explain, because we haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for columns and beams in 100 years. This is elemental iron, not steel, not melted steel that we're talking about here. It would also explain the presence of sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So let's get into it, because the NFPA Guide 921 also says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. This says, as you heard, they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. A year later, they finally say in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for, what you won't look for. So others did, though. And in fact, one of them was Professor Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, who does some testing on the ends of the beams at the International Peace Park in Manitoba. First of all, finding that, gosh, it's curious that this wandering torch by this drunken iron worker seems very curious. Iron workers cut straight across with extremely hot torches, and they're very capable of cutting straight lines. So something else was going on there and here. And so he gets real curious and performs X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, finding in the beam the elements of iron oxide, or elemental iron and aluminum, the key ingredients of thermite, along with manganese and sulfur. So that to him is a sure sign that thermite was used here. And he turns to the actual studies that the U.S. Geological Survey did on the powder surrounding the World Trade Center for 3 square miles, this blanket of dust. And he finds that they found billions of these previously molten iron microspheres. They're almost naked to the human eye. Some of them a 1/16 of an inch large, but they're in all the World Trade Center dust samples, evenly distributed, more in the samples closer to the towers, less in the samples further away, but in all of them. This is very curious because they're elemental iron. Well, how did elemental iron microspheres get in all the World Trade Center dust samples? They don't know. They don't even speculate. In fact, up to 6% of some of these dust samples are composed of these iron microspheres. It amounts to about 4 tons by extrapolation, 150 times the amount of background iron that might be in common dust, like you see on the left here. But these are spheres, not just odd-shaped particles. And R.J. Lee Group, another an environmental engineering group that is doing studying on the dust samples, has also found these in all of their samples, and they confirm and conclude that these were formed during the event, not before, say, by the welders constructing the site, not afterward by the iron workers deconstructing the site, but during the event. Well, how could they be formed during the event? We know that it takes 2,800 degrees to melt iron or steel. And so there's so many of them that the EPA says that these are used to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all these previously molten iron microspheres in it. Well, how do they form? Well, let's look at this thermite experiment. It's not too difficult. You light thermite, it creates 2,800 degree temperatures and melts the iron oxide as the oxide moves from the iron to the aluminum, off-gassing as aluminum ash, leaving molten iron microspheres. Why spheres? Well, aerosolized liquids form themselves due to surface tension into spherical droplets. And then in the case of the molten iron, they cool and fall and damage cars, the tops of these cars. What other element in the official narrative of this high heat event can explain the toasting of the tops of these cars? So it's actually not difficult to take thermite and make your own shaped cutter charges. It does require a shaped cutter charge, as you see here, which forces the liquid molten iron through the steel, as John Cole did in these backyard experiments in Florida. Yeah, cutting cleanly through the structural steel. Well, you don't have to do it in your backyard. You can use very sophisticated thermite shaped cutter charges patented prior to 9/11 that issue streams of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, cutting through much thicker sections of structural steel than can RDX or C4 or other high energy explosives. So why else might you not use those? Well, they provide very loud bangs and very bright flashes. So in a deceptive controlled demolition, you might want to avoid those obvious audio and visual signatures and try something else like molten iron. And in fact, there are similar devices whose casings themselves are made out of consolidated, consumable thermite. Nothing left in the debris except pools of molten iron, which we'll discover were pulled out of the World Trade Center buildings by the ton after they cool. They're called meteorites. We'll get to that in 2 weeks from today in this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. But first, let's talk about what else was found in the World Trade Center dust. In this case, a team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen have samples brought to them, 7 altogether, and 4 were ultimately put in this peer-reviewed paper. One of them from Jeanette McKinley, whose apartment windows were blown in by the incredible explosive force of the South Tower demolition, and and we'll get to that next week. Her apartment was filled with this dust. She was an artist. She collected it, and she paid for that decision with her life, very tragically succumbing to brain cancer a few years later. But one of these samples is hers. They get real curious about these because they thought they were paint at first, but examining them carefully, they're attracted by a magnet. So they have iron in them. Iron content is one of the key components of thermite. And so they zoom into the red layer or do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the red layer, finding yet again, in this case, unignited residue of iron oxide, including iron oxide and aluminum, with silica, carbon, and oxygen. We'll come back to that. So what are the ingredients of thermite doing in the paint chips throughout the World Trade Center dust found in all the samples that they collected here? Well, they zoom into the red layer 50,000 times to find out. They find nanoparticles smaller than a human hair, 1,000 times smaller, of iron oxide, rhomboidal-shaped crystals, and aluminum platelets. Very sophisticated materials set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, organic material, which is responsible in TNT, for instance, for the explosive effect, the concussion. High energy explosives work by means of knocking things over. They do that because of this organic material. So here you have incendiary materials mixed with organic materials at 420 centigrade, 750 or so Celsius. They ignite in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter. What happens when they ignite? Well, first of all, the ignition shows that this is exothermic materials. There's not paint. And when they ignite, they produce, there we go, they produce spheres, iron spheres, molten iron spheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron spheres produced and are found in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where these red grade chips came from. We know where these microspheres came from. They came from these red grade chips. So you see, this is a set of repeatable, self-corroborating experimental evidence that can be used in a court of law to bring these perpetrators, the real perpetrators, to justice. Perpetrators who had access to the most sophisticated nanothermites. We're not talking about a cave in Afghanistan here, as if we didn't know where these came from. The spheres are found attached to partially ignited red grade chips, as you see here and here. When these spheres, when these components are reduced to the nano scale, they react very differently. The surface volume increases exponentially. So the chemical reaction time is decreased exponentially. So you've engineered an incendiary to become an explosive. It's not made in your garage. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we have a source of inquiry here that can be used by real criminal investigators and enterprising journalists who want to really know and speak and publish the truth about what happened here at the World Trade Center. You can start with this peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, which concludes that the red layer of these red-grade chips is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. You can download this and send it around. It's been available for almost 10 years now. So what we've shown today is the first is 10 key characteristic features of explosive or incendiary demolition. Direct evidence. Fire doesn't have these features. This is not evidence of destruction by fire. It doesn't produce any of them, let alone all of these features. The fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but again, asymmetrically, with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. Why don't fires bring buildings down? No, this is important. Well, the steel conducts that heat away from the source. It's just a multi-hundred. There's tons. This is a tons of heat sink. It distributes that heat. So we don't have the steel ever getting to its 1200 degree temperature at which it can sag. And that's a critical temperature. It loses half of its strength and begins to sag. But we don't want that to happen because that can happen in very hot fires. So we put cementitious fireproofing on these beams. 2 hours on the beams, 3 hours on the columns keeping that building from ever getting to a point where it can fail or expand thermally, per NIST's initiation of collapse theory. This is 4 to 6 times more time to protect the building than a fire has to burn in any one area. We also keep the contractors from building out of combustible materials. And we keep the tenants from bringing in more than a minimum of combustible materials. Desks and chairs and paper and stuff is all they can bring in there. And to keep all that from ever becoming a problem, we sprinkler these buildings so that it puts out the fire before it can ever be a problem. In the case of Building 7, the sprinklers were said to have been compromised by the collapse of the Twin Towers, the sprinkler mains. So let's look into these reports just a little bit. There were official investigations starting, as we mentioned, 2002 in FEMA. They had $600,000 worth of funding, which is minuscule compared to the space shuttle disaster or the effort to determine the source of the stains on Monica Lewinsky's dress. But the New York Times cites that they had bureaucratic restrictions and couldn't get access to the site, couldn't get access to the blueprints of the building, couldn't get access to the public to ask for photographs and so forth. So this is really quite a compromise to the efforts here. But we saw what they produced in the way of the metallurgical examination in Appendix C of the Building Performance Assessment Report, which is very valuable, which NIST threw out in 2002 when they took over. And they came up with their own theory, again, that fire caused the collapse of the building. They admit in 2006, truthfully, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Yeah, we agree. They completely threw out this Appendix C report. And FEMA cites that further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, we have the complete destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day taking this steel out of the Twin Towers, putting it on barges, and shipping it to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cite crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But of course, it wasn't. And so we have so many experts who were not tied to financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion, like in this case, Danny Jowenko.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And this gentleman from the Hugo Bachmann, from chairman of Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. Kamal Obeid in the San Francisco Bay Area, a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. And that's why we consulted the University of Alaska. Professor Leroy Halsey, the chairman of the Department of Structural and Civil Engineering and Environmental Engineering, who with his team of PhD researchers, and he's one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, performed a 4-year analysis of this building. The analysis that NIST was tasked to do by Congress, but which they failed, as we've seen. But here you have an independent analysis now, finite element analysis. And what does he say? Well, there's a problem here. No other tall steel frame building has ever failed due to fire. This is the first one. We have to know what's going on here. We have to ensure the public safety, that the failure mechanism must be understood. So he examines the approach here. The science is to examine the response to the fire loads, rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, and identify those types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. So he uses the same input values as NIST does, for better or worse. In other words, a very conservative test using NIST's presumptions, which many of which we've proven already are false, but we want to compare apples to apples here. So he has 3 approaches. 1, simulate the local structural response to fire loading for floors 13 and below, because that's what NIST concentrated. 2, examine the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis. And 3, simulate numerous failure scenarios that could lead to the total collapse as observed in the videos of the collapse. So he puts all of the data from the building structure into AutoCAD and then models it on Advocacy software, and then models it also on another software called SAP 2000, focusing on the initiation of collapse theory to see if it could have ever happened here on column 79 with these expanding beams. And he concludes some remarkable things here, pointing out, first of all, that 30 shear studs were omitted by NIST, pointing out that steel stiffeners were omitted, as we discussed, pointing out that the 13th floor could not have damaged the 12th floor, even if it did fall, pointing out that the exterior wall was not infinitely stiff, as NIST claimed, meaning that the movement is out toward the exterior wall, not toward the inside where it's much stiffer. So what are the key findings then? Approach 1, NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. They found they were flexible. They found that the movement of girder A2001 was in the opposite direction. They found through Advocacy in approach 2 that the shear connections on several beams that NIST says were broken could not have happened. They wouldn't have been broken. That the bolts fastening this girder to its seat wouldn't be broken either. And in SAP 2000, they found in approach 3 that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail at all. And if they did fail, because they made them fail, they found that the building would have tipped over, not gone straight down. It would have tipped over, as you're seeing in this model here. And then finally, they found that the collapse of Building 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse, as NIST claimed, which they said involved the sequential failure of columns throughout the building. So a global failure, which results in a failure like the University of Alaska at Fairbanks models here, where the whole building does indeed fail, as we see in the videos. So the essential findings are that fire could not have caused the collapse of Building 7. The temperature was not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel frame. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders, and Building 7 did not experience that progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. So when you put all 3 together, you see which actually looks like the video of the collapse of Building 7. The University of Alaska on the left, or the pathetic animation of NIST's on the right. Which one looks like the actual video in the middle? So what we've concluded here is that we have support for the hypothesis of controlled demolition, especially when you consider additional circumstantial corroborative testimony like foreknowledge of the destruction of this building, in which this anonymous engineer actually predicts the collapse is going to happen in 5 hours. I'm not kidding you. The chief Hayden, says, if we allowed it to burn in a collapse, how soon? If we allowed it to burn, how soon would we anticipate a collapse? The guy says, in its current state, you have about 5 hours. So, an unprecedented event, the collapse of a steel frame building by fire alone. And the guy's actually saying it's going to take 5 hours. Hey, who is this engineer? We got to find out. They won't tell us. He's completely anonymous. Obviously, he had foreknowledge of when this building was going to come down, as did these construction workers who are walking away from Building 7. Hear an explosion over their shoulder, look back over their shoulder, look straight into this CNN camera, and say this.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Blue flame, debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? How do they know the building is about to blow up? No building that's been on fire has ever blown up and come down before. Well, here's Kevin McPadden, that Air Force medic who we heard talk about explosions. Prior to that testimony, he and others are held back about 6 blocks away from Building 7 because they're told that it's going to come down. They're told that it had structural damage due to the beams that hit it from Building 7, even though that's not a cause of the official collapse according to NIST. And he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. This is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
At the last few seconds, he took his hands off, and you heard 3, 2, 1. What? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What is going on here? And what's going on over at the BBC, who announced the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened? Take a look.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does this make them psychic? What's going on? And over here at CNN, where they announced the collapse of a 50-story building at 11:07. Listen to Alan Dodds-Frank here.
In New York, Alan Dodds-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabi and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Had Building 7 come down 15 minutes after the last tower came down, we would not even have video of it. It would have been obscured by the massive dust cloud completely covering Manhattan. Was it supposed to go down at that time? That's what some researchers suggest. And that's why those, speculating that that's why those construction workers were coming out of that building in the afternoon claiming it was about to come down. They weren't rescue workers. So let's go to the building's owner, Larry Silverstein, who was interviewed a year after 9/11 talking about Building 7. Here's what he has to say.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Oh, Larry says, well, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, wait a minute. The firefighters were told not to go into the building. Take a look. FEMA says the firefighters made the decision fairly early on not to attempt to fight the fires, due in part to the damage to the building. They were kept out of the building. No firefighting operations were taken by the FDNY. NIST and FEMA acknowledge that. Well, looking at the evidence today, what is the conclusion that you reach using the scientific method? Did fire bring the building down, or did controlled demolition bring the building down? Do we have the 10 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition? Is that direct evidence to you of destruction with explosives? Can fire account for any one of those, let alone all 10? Is there additional circumstantial and corroborative testimony providing to you proof of controlled demolition? That's what we want to know. Let Andy know. He's going to tell you how to do just that and to ask your questions. So we'll get to those.
All right, folks. So at this time, submit any questions you might have in the input form that we discussed earlier. That's at ae911truth.org under continuing education, and then you select the live webinars. You'll see it. Also, we're going to be telling you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you, Andy. And just realized that my green screen went down on me again. So I'm shifting gears over here. And so those questions can be placed right here, as Andy mentioned. And while you're there, subscribe to our newsletter. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth puts out the latest evidence that we're gathering, the latest efforts and successes we have toward getting a real, unimpeachable investigation that's not co-opted. So you can get informed also on our website while you're there. We have a lot of evidence about all three controlled demolitions here. And sign the petition while you're there. If you're an architect or engineer, you can sign on as such. Joining the 3,000, we need more. We need all of them, apparently. It just takes a lot to slap the media in the face to get some attention here in Congress. And if you're not architect or engineer, sign on to support them. We have 20,000 others doing just that. And donate while you're on our website. We have lots of need for your support. There's a team of 6 of us, and we travel around the country providing architects and engineers the evidence at conferences. We've sent 75,000 postcards, for instance, to engineers all around the country about the study, World Trade Center 7 finite element analysis that we just told you about. We have all kinds of other projects that we're going to be telling you about, and it requires your support. So you can also join the family of sustaining supporters. Our annual membership drive is coming up this month, so you can take the opportunity then or now to become a sustaining supporter of AE 9/11 Truth. Join the 1,000 plus family members who give $5 a month. Can you afford $5 a month to support architects and engineers? I'm guessing yes, and you wouldn't be still listening to this program if you weren't bothered, at least by the evidence that we've been presenting. And so join us. It takes a huge team, a family of effort supporting us and getting the word out as well. And if you can't do that, gosh, volunteer with us. Andy, what are some of those opportunities?
Absolutely. If you just got a few hours a week to donate to a really important cause, obviously, I believe this is the one that you should be donating that time to. There's lots of things that you can do depending on your personality and your time commitment. But all of these projects that you hear about us doing, from the emails and what Richard announces here on these webinars, it takes people to make them happen. And there's no job too small or too big that isn't contribute to the final goal that we are all seeking. So if you have the time to do that and you want to get your hands in the dirt here, not the dirt of in terms of some that it's dirty work or anything like that, but get your hands into the earth here and do what we need to do, then please go to ae911truth.org and click that volunteer form, and we'll get in touch with you within a few days.
All these teams need your help. So yeah, thank you so much for considering that. And you can do things on your own too. Send out our website, our URL, ae911truth.org, to elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers. Make an appointment with your elected representative, and we will do the actual meeting for you. So put us to work, but you make the appointment. We'll be there to do the work. Contact us about how you do that. And in fact, tell everybody, you know, every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else, screen the DVDs to your friends, neighbors, colleagues. Share the brochures on our website. You can get 100 of them for $10 and hand them out to people one-on-one. You got to do something. Your conscience won't let you just do nothing with this information. Or if it does, then I worry about you. But don't let me do that. Put me to work. That's why I'm here. Let's put the WTC7 evaluation to work, and let's put more into the feet of NIST, as we just did a 100-page request for correction, which identifies 8 key problems that NIST had with their investigation. The column side plate on trapping the girder, so it couldn't even have fallen off of its seat. The thermal expansion hoax that we talked about. The web stiffeners that were omitted that we talked about. All of this we have submitted to NIST in the form of a request for correction. Their faulty global collapse analysis, their hiding of the eroded steel, the eyewitnesses of explosions that have been omitted from the NIST reports. So this is an example of the things that take us behind the scenes. 50 to 100 hours of work went into this 100-page report, and now they have less than 3 months to respond to it. So I think it's less than 2 months now. It's a very exciting opportunity for us, because we will sue them if they don't provide, and we don't expect them to provide the response back. But we will take them to task when they don't, and that's another reason we're going to Congress. Andy, what are the opportunities here with the Bobby McIlvaine Act?
Yes, this is the road to justice for the nearly 3,000 people who died on September 11th. That's what it's all about. And it's named the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who died in the North Tower on the morning of September 11th. He was killed by an explosion. there. So by the very nature of how he died, we have an immediate conversation starter when we talk to our members of Congress about it. And what this would do is draft legislation that would create a new investigation. It would create a select committee in either House of Congress to investigate what Richard has been talking about for the last couple of hours here. It would look into why these buildings came down and not just take NIST talking points, but actually look at the evidence of controlled demolition. But as I always say, each week we do these webinars that Congress doesn't do anything unless they hear from a lot of their constituents. So that's why you have to get involved. Now, a very simple way to get involved is do what Richard brought up earlier. We're doing phone meetings with our members of Congress. It's revolving around the RFC with NIST, but we sometimes mention the Bobby McIlvaine Act too, because that was the Bobby McIlvaine Act is what the RFC will hopefully lead to at some point. And the congressmen want to hear from you more so than they want to hear from us. So you got to get that first step rolling and set up that meeting for us, and then we'll do a lot of the work involved. To learn more about the Bobby McIlvaine Act, you go to ae911truth.org/justice. And there's a lot of activism tools on there that you can do when you have time to get the message out. But we need your participation in order to get this passed.
Beautiful. And we want you to know that we've also submitted 60 exhibits of our evidence through the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry to the Attorney General in the Southern Manhattan District. And he's written back, yeah, we will comply with the law requiring us to give this to a special grand jury. So we've now filed a mandamus lawsuit requiring him to tell us that how that's going, because it's been a while now, and we're looking for answers. So we're hoping to get him too. And that's why we've sued the FBI, because they did not give the evidence that we've given them to Congress when Congress tasked them to provide them all the additional evidence since the 9/11 Commission report up to the 9/11 Review Commission in 2015. So that's forthcoming as well. And all of this is the reason why we have 5 commissioners, fire commissioners in a New York City, in a New York area city, led by Chris Joya, who says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we'll be an unstoppable force, because this association of volunteer firefighters, which are by far the largest number of firefighters in the state of New York, all of them, in fact, outside of Manhattan, are volunteer firefighters. So they became the first elected body in the country to officially support a new investigation into the destruction of 9/11. So very exciting opportunities there. And if you haven't seen 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, that's our flagship documentary, which goes through all the evidence and more, with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. Here's just a taste.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
Oops.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was
keep going.
removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And you can take a look at that free on YouTube, the 1-hour version, or the 1.5-hour version is available on our website store at ae911truth.org. You'll get the second, well, it's an 1.5-hour version, but you'll also get additional extended interviews with each of these experts. So that's really important stuff for you to understand too. Beyondmisinformation.org is where you can download the free 50-page booklet, which challenges NIST on every front and all of this evidence in a. You can also get the coffee table version of it for I think it's about $10 is all, on in our store, and also on YouTube the 2-hour version, which includes of this lecture, our classic presentation, the research edition, includes all 3 towers. And then on YouTube also the 15-minute version of Building 7 documentary, professionally made for PBS, and that's available for you on YouTube as well. And let's go to questions and answers. Hopefully we have some answers to some of these questions, Andy.
All right, our first one actually comes from YouTube. It says, Richard, could you say something about the blast sequence of World Trade Center 7 because you can see it just before the building goes to the ground?
There are some curious puffs of air high in the building on the right side of a particular video that I can't name right now. I don't have the name. And many in the 9/11 research community consider those as squibs or explosive ejections. And I'm kind of thinking that might be true, but also it might be true that they're puffs of air being produced by the pressure in the building of the fire, because there is a fire on that floor. There's a lot of smoke. At least on the back side of that building. So, Andy, do you have more to say about that? Because I don't.
I don't either, because it's one of those things that you really have to zoom in on and get an idea of what it actually is. And sometimes there's just not enough detail or not enough video angles and all of this to make that determination. So we try to be conservative with what we put out there, because we certainly have people out there looking to go after anything we say on this, and even if it's backed up with the most thorough evidence that you can find. So, that's why we haven't really focused on that very much.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, we really do try to stick to the hardest core evidence. I mean, this presentation's already just on building 7 here. It's already over an hour and a half. So we try to narrow it down.
All right. Our next question says, last month you asked for some tough questions. So here is one.
Oh, shit.
If Building 7 was rigged with the intention of making it collapse, was it always the intention to blame the collapse on fires, or were the fires plan B? If fire was plan B, how do you guarantee there will be fires, and how do you make sure those fires do not interfere with the demolition charges that will be the real reason for the collapse? Barry Jennings heard multiple explosions before the first collapse, but there was a triage location in the loading dock area. Did any of the first responders there ever mention those explosions?
I haven't heard of first responders mentioning the explosions. There was a triage area, but according to, what's her name? This banking person who was also an EMT volunteering that day said they moved the triage area out of Building 7. And I don't know why. Well, we can imagine why. It was coming down, right? Which they had evidence of. So Barry Jennings also said he was walking over dead bodies, which might make sense. I don't know why they'd leave all the dead bodies there. If there was a triage area and people were dying, you'd think they would have evacuated those dead bodies. So it's an inconsistency there that I don't understand. Andy, you might have more on that. But the original question here is, if Building 7 was rigged with intention of making it collapse, was it always the intention to blame the collapse on fires? Or were fires plan B? I'm just guessing. We don't know what their intentions are, of course, but if they're going to bring a building down, we showed how they reported a collapse of the building 15 minutes after the towers came down, a 50-story building, which never happened. There was no other building that came down. There's some buildings that were damaged, but there's no building at all that came down, much less a 50-story building, which is close to 47 stories here with Building 7. I think its intention, I'm guessing, the intention was to have it, to bring it down surreptitiously without fire under the cover of the smoke that would have filled lower Manhattan for the half hour or several hours after the towers came down. So we would have never known about Building 7. Now, after that building didn't come down, I'm guessing that they just panicked and that they had to all of a sudden go up there and set some fires. And where did they set them? The worst fires were on the floors 12 and 13, where the Securities and Exchange Commission was. The worst fires that we have, and the Securities and Exchange Commission lost thousands of files related to hundreds of very high profile cases like Enron and WorldCom. So if the fires weren't set there beforehand, maybe they set them, after the building didn't come down. I don't know. As far as the fires interfering with the controlled demolition, they might have. But these are all independently, one would imagine that they're independently set with timers, not wired throughout the whole building, because that's not what you do in a situation where you have an occupied building. You just don't have the kind of time and space that you would in a normal controlled demolition in a building that's empty of occupants, and you have you have time to prep and set out those charges and so forth. So in other words, if some of those thermite charges went off early, so what? It probably wouldn't bring the building down. That's what I'm guessing, if the fires could set those. But thermite, it has to be set with, like 3,000 or 4,000 degree temperatures. Magnesium rods, for instance, it's not easy to set. So it probably wouldn't, under normal fire conditions, be set off anyway, those shape cutter charges. What do you think, Andy?
These are really interesting questions. The problem is that there's a lot of people that ask us questions as if we were in on the plot or something, or sitting in, can go back, and we have no idea what the perpetrators expected to do, what went wrong for them, what they were hoping. The essence of our argument is this, and this might be a bit of a gruesome scenario to lay out, but let's say you're walking through the park one day and you find a person body with their head chopped off, and you say, oh my God, there must be a murder here. You call the police, and the police come back and say, oh, I know you probably think it was a murder, but actually, no, we have a new phenomenon. The guy was walking, the victim was walking, and his head just rolled off his body and fell on the ground, and he died. And you say, well, I've never heard of that happening before. And they say, yeah, it's a new phenomenon, happened just today. And you start looking around some of the circumstances behind this victim and their relationship with the police, and you say, there's something fishy going on here, because heads don't just roll off bodies. Because that's what we've been told happened. So what we can tell you is we can show you the video of the building coming down, show you the science, show you the impossibility of the government's official story, point to how controlled demolition was the likely suspect in bringing this building down, and call for a new investigation. All of these other details and what they expected to happen, I would love to find that out myself. But we got to get to the new investigation to get there. But there's some things are impossible to know unless you are actually in on the planning.
Good points.
Okay, our next question says, NIST said the outer shell of Building 7 was so strong that it survived the collapse of the interior. If the outer shell was that strong, then why would the outer shell collapse at all, and especially symmetrically?
Great question. These questions are for NIST because they claim that the interior collapsed first, and of course, if the interior collapsed, we noted the building would have crumpled up like a beer can, because the outer shell would have been pulled in various points due to the integral and robust structural steel frame, which is very rigidly connected at the outer shell. But in their computer model, they simply gave up all those connections because they manipulate the input data, which is why they won't release it to us under the Freedom of Information Act request, under the only out that they had, which was it might jeopardize public safety. So, yeah, the outer shell would have collapsed without the interior shell, but it wouldn't have been symmetrical. So it's a great question. It would have, again, crumpled up like a beer can and fallen over, wiping out other buildings around. So I appreciate the question, and that's the best answer I have. You have anything to add to that, Andy?
I don't know. Maybe it's the same kind of physics that has Wile E. Coyote walk off the cliff for a few feet before he realizes that he's supposed to fall, and falls plummeting to the ground. Maybe Building 7's outer shell did the same thing.
Yeah.
Makes more sense than NIST. Why do NIST top investigators John Gross and Shyam Sunder insist that overall Building 7 came down at 40% longer time than free fall would take, but then they have no problem at all in saying the top of the Twin Towers fell through the buildings essentially in free fall? Is it because it's easier to pull the wool over the public's eyes when airplanes fly into buildings, but not when fire alone is to blame? Good point. Richard?
Yeah. NIST did early on deny that the building 7 came down at free fall. Sham Sunder's quoted as saying, that would mean there'd be no structure under the building. And he's right. But then he comes back and final report and acknowledges that it did come down at free fall. Well, what happened to the structure under the building, Sham? We want to know the same thing. And he did acknowledge that buildings 1 and 2, the twin towers, came down essentially at free fall. Well, what happened to the structure there? So he's got some real problems, and he's dancing around like a banshee. Wait, that's racist. We have to call him to task, and that's why I'm hoping you'll take all these questions and then we combine them, and then we send them to NIST, and we publicly publish it with an open letter to NIST. All of these great questions. They won't answer them, of course, but they need to be assembled because they're great questions.
All right. The last question today said, NIST said the interior of Building 7 was gutted before the exterior shell of the building fell, but their model only shows half of the interior collapsing before the entire building starts to collapse. Is this a contradiction?
They acknowledge in their report that they're only modeling the east side of the building. They made the west side of the building infinitely rigid. So I don't know how they justify any kind of accuracy given that internal contradiction in their finite element analysis. You see the east side just falling like a sandcastle. The columns are giving up their connections at a rate of 400 connections failing every second of this building's 7-second collapse. So essentially, they've only modeled the east third of the building. But then they go ahead and try to model the whole building coming down. There's no way they can justify that. And the University of Alaska went ahead and modeled the whole building to show that it would have tipped over if only 1 or 2 or 3 columns. Well, it wouldn't have failed at all with 3 columns. That's what they found. But if you force them to fail, those columns, i.e., you slice them, then indeed the building begins to overload and it tips, which is what would happen naturally, as opposed to what you see in the NIST computer model, which is like firing a sandcastle with a fire hose. So that's my thought. Any thoughts over there, Andy?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, there's a lot of great questioners that reveal a lot of inconsistencies in this report that we don't even catch ourselves. So we will get these over to NIST at some point. I think there's one person in particular who I think is the one submitting many questions, and I would love to see him and Shyam Sunder in the same room. I think Sunder would be in tears by the time he was done with them. So keep them coming. And Richard's right. Send them to NIST, because many times all we can say is, yeah, good point. But NIST is the one who should be accounting for all these inconsistencies and are not. So that's all I have to say. And have a good weekend, everybody.
Yeah, and we'll be happy to send them to NIST if you want to assemble them. And that would be really fun to publish them on our website. Yeah, thanks so much for the great questions, and also for joining us today on part 1 of 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Now, when we come back next Thursday, as we do the first 3 Thursdays of every month, we'll be looking at part 2, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction, with an overview, the evidence of explosions and eyewitness testimony, the sudden near free fall collapse of the towers, the high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering of the steel frame, the midair pulverization of concrete, and a lot more. And then the Thursday after that, we come back and look at the extreme heat in the towers with the high-rise fires, more details in the fires, more details in the pyroclastic expanding clouds of molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite, and a lot more detail than we were able to get into today. So that is it. And yes, that's going to be part 3 next week. So be sure to join us. And we'll see you then. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody. Until then, bye for now.